In part 1 of our discussion on the history of sculpture outside the Philippines, we already discussed prehistoric sculpture up to sculptures that existed during ancient civilization, particularly during classical period, no, such as ancient Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. Okay. Now, after the classical period comes the medieval period, also known as the Middle Ages or Dark Ages. Okay. Bakit nagsimula yung medieval period? Nagsimula yung medieval period nung bumagsak yung Roman Empire. Lumawak yung influence ng Rome because of Alexander the Great, no? Napalawak, kaya nga siya tinawag na Alexander the Great kasi napalawak niya yung Roman Empire hanggang Africa, Europe, and even parts of Asia. Diba? So, napakalawak ng Roman Empire. Nung bumagsak yung Roman Empire, ito na yung start ng panibagong yugto ng kasaysayan. And then what we know now as the medieval period or Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. So, during this period, there are many styles in sculpture and in art in general. And some of them are the Byzantine sculpture, Romanesque sculpture, 9th century sculpture, Gothic sculpture, early Christian sculpture. So here are some of the different styles in sculpture found during the medieval period. So let's start with the Byzantine sculpture. Byzantine sculpture represents the Christianization of Rome. Tandaan natin, during the medieval period, ang pinakamakapangyarihan na institusyon ay simbahan. So, controlled mostly ng simbahan lahat ng aspeto ng buhay ng tao. Kahit political, economic aspect, syempre religious or spiritual aspect, diba? And even in art, no, influenced ng church kasi nga it's considered as the most powerful institution in the medieval period. So, yung unang style ng sculpture na didiscuss natin under medieval period, Byzantine sculpture represents Christianization of Rome. There was a great number of churches and basilicas constructed in the beginning. No statues adorned churches. Instead, the fish was used to symbolize Christ. A hand protruding from the clouds symbolized God. There is a slow growth in sculpture kasi nga, since church yung most powerful institution and they have control almost in all aspects of human life, in this particular period, the medieval period, karamihan ng mga forms of art na pinatayo na umusbong, no, during the medieval period ay mga cathedrals, mga simbahan. Okay, so, lalo yung Byzantine period, sa medieval age, walang ganong growth, no, sa sculpture. Mas architectural yung mga artworks na lumilitaw, umuusbong during this particular time. Okay. Next to Byzantine sculpture is Romanesque sculpture. This was developed in the later part of the medieval ages. Sculpture became subordinated to architecture. Usually yung sculpture attached siya sa stonework, so relief architecture, sa mga walls usually ng simbahan or ng mga religious institutions or structures rather than freestanding. The carved images become part of the architecture. So usually mga makikita sila sa walls ng simbahan, ng kumbento, ng mga cathedrals. Ayan. Ninth century sculpture. Sculpture was still governed by the church kasi nga sabi ko kanina, 'di ba, during sa kabuuan ng medieval period, religion yung pinaka-powerful. No experimentation was allowed. Christ was presented as fully garbed, mature, dark-bearded man with haunting eyes. The church laid down laws on how biblical characters were to be presented. No? So kahit sa art, walang freedom, no, of artistic expression kasi nga kontrolado ito ng church kahit kung paano ipoportray ng mga artist si Christ. Merong law or regulations yung simbahan dito. Hence, all figures of Christ or Jesus are tall, dignified, and straight. The robes were always exquisitely carved, sometimes covered with jewels. Next is the Gothic sculpture. Although similar to Romanesque sculpture, still Gothic sculpture is subordinate to architecture. Again, kasi nga karamihan ng mga structures na pinapatayo, architecture, simbahan, cathedrals. It differed in the presentation of the human figure, although great attention was still given to the carving of their garments. Tulad na makikita niyo dito sa mga drapes ng suot nila. The figures gave the impression of real bodies and limbs underneath the clothes. Katulad niyan. Yung human figure, o yung tuhod. Early Christian or sarcophagy sculpture. Pag sinabi nating sarcophagy, it came from the word sarcophagus. It's a term used to indicate certain type of limestone for coffin making sa paggawa ng kabaong. So itong sculpture na to, mukha nga siyang kabaong, kaya siya tinawag na sarcophagy sculpture. Sarcophagic sculpture emerged to refer to sepulchral chests. Ayan. Siyang kabaong, no? Okay, so paano naman natapos yung medieval period? So after ng medieval period, yung sumunod dyan na historical period ay yung tinatawag natin na Renaissance, or also known as the Enlightenment period. Unti-unting nanghina yung kapangyarihan ng simbahan. Sa France, nagkaroon ng French Revolution. Humina na rin yung mga monarkiya na sinusuportahan ng simbahan. Kaya dito na unti-unting nabubuwag yung mga monarkiya at yung power ng church. Na-enlighten yung mga tao. They wanted to go back to reason, logic, science na namatay during the medieval period kasi nga religion, no? Religion over reason yung namamayagpag during the medieval period. Nabuwag ito during Renaissance period or Enlightenment period dahil ayan, nag-aklas yung mga tao, na-liberate sila from darkness, from religion. They went back to reason. So dito na mayagpag ulit yung mga innovations, maraming discoveries, inventions, ayan. Renaissance sculpture is a revival of Greek and Roman trends from the classical period. The word itself, Renaissance, is a French word which means rebirth. Sa Tagalog ng rebirth, panganak ulit. So ano yung gusto nilang ipanganak ulit? So nila ulit ipanganak yung classical period. Now they wanted to give birth to classical period again. Kaya in philosophy, in science, and even in art, no? Bumabalik sa classical period or nire-revive ng mga tao from the Renaissance yung classical antiquity. Some amount of perspective entered the art. Sculpture became more secular. Sinabi nating secular, ito ay outside the control of church and gained independence from the church. Okay. Yung Ninja Turtles, kung nanonood kayo ng Ninja Turtles, si Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, sila ay mga Renaissance men. Okay. So, isa sa mga Ninja Turtles ay si Michelangelo. Isa siya sa mga notable sculptors during the Renaissance period at ilan sa mga notable artworks niya in sculpture ay itong Pieta. Ayan, nakikita niyo dito sa aking slide. At itong si David. Michelangelo Buonarroti, born March 6, 1475 in Florence, Italy, is considered as the major sculptor of all time. He revived classical values in art by maximizing the full potential of the human form as a symbol of power through his preoccupation with musculature or the arrangement of muscles in body parts, and his use of contrapposto, wherein the figure dynamically distorts and turns around its axis in contrapuntal movement. Tulad na makikita ninyo dito sa sculptures niya ng Pieta and David, no, yung mga katawan, yung mga muscles, diba? Yung details ng muscles, ng skin, kitang-kita sa hubog ng kanyang ukit, no? Famous si Michelangelo diyan. Ganon din yung hindi lang siya basta na maximize no yung mga joints kung saan gumagalaw yung mga tao katulad nito, 'di ba? Dito sa Pieta, yung mother and child. Ayan. Hindi lang basta straight na nakatayo yung tao dun sa sculpture, no? May nai-imply na movement dun sa sculpture. Ayan. So ito napaka-famous nitong mga to ng Pieta and David ni Michelangelo. Donatello is another famous sculptor during the Renaissance period. He impressed in his works living people out of stone by suggesting weight, balance, and psychological depth, characterized by natural pose and authority, with the weight of the body descending through one leg, like in his artwork of Saint Mark. Ito yan si Saint Mark. Ayan. Ito, meron din siyang David. Yung David, inspired yan sa David and Goliath, kung alam niyo yung story na yun. Maraming ginagawang subject or inspiration ng mga great artist, no? Si David and Goliath. Actually, pati yung mother and child. Makikita nyo karamihan sa mga painters, sculptors. No? Isa sa mga notable artworks nila ay yung versions nila ng Pieta o ng mother and child. David din. Baroque sculpture. Baroque sculpture existed during Renaissance period. One of the notable sculptor, okay, na Baroque yung style is Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Yung kanyang style ay tinatawag na chiaroscuro. It is a restless and dynamic style with diagonals and floating lines, as well as striking treatment of light and shades in an engraving. Meron din siyang David. Ito ay matatagpuan sa Galleria Borghese. Daphne and Apollo. Ito yung ilan sa kanyang mga notable sculptures. Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Ayan. So, yung style na mapapansin sa kanyang sculpture, yung tinatawag natin na chiaroscuro. Diba? Kita niyo yung mga floating lines, diagonals, diba? Yung shades from the light, no, mas nagbibigyang emphasis yung mga details sa kanyang ukit. Baroque sculpture is a reactionary movement to the classical form in 17th century. Sculpture was a means to express states of the soul, kaya very expressive yung, halimbawa yung mukha. Kung i-close up mo tong mukha nito ni David na version ni Bernini, diba? Kitang-kita mo yung emotions. Same din dito, no, kay Daphne and Apollo. If you look closely to their faces, kita mo, no, very expressive yung emotions, no? Figures depicted all ranges of human emotions, characterized by dynamic intensity. There's a strong interplay of light, shadow, and movement characterized in all of Bernini's works. At yun yung paggamit niya ng chiaroscuro sa kanyang sculpture. Rococo sculpture, another style or artistic movement during the Renaissance period. Rococo sculpture is highly ornate and exquisite. Okay. Yung details niya suggests pomp and wealth, katulad ng mga nakikita nyo dito sa slide. This style was first used in the court of the French royalty. Rococo art appeared largely in furniture, panels, vases, and urns. Siyempre alam naman natin na yung sa loob ng palace, no, ng French royalty, ng mga monarchs, yung mga magagaling na mga artists and artisans sa kanilang lipunan, no, yung gumagawa ng mga kung anumang furniture at kung ano mang gamit na nasa loob ng palasyo. At isa sa mga style ng sa architect sa sculpture ay yung Rococo. So, very ornate and exquisite. Tsaka tulad na nakikita nyo dito sa vase na to, di ba? Yan. Pangmayaman. Itong cabinet na to. Yan. Rococo yan. 19th century sculpture. Neoclassical and realistic romantic. Pag 19th century, ito yung taon mula 1801 hanggang 1900. Neoclassical sculpture depicted perfect human anatomy and endowed with the human figure with a calm, reflective look in imitation of the Greeks. Kaya siya neoclassical. No? May revival din ng classical antiquity sa sculpture. But mas perfect yung depiction o yung pagportray ng human anatomy. Yan. Yung location ng eyes, yan. Lahat, pati yung imperfections. Quote-unquote, imperfections. Romanticism, which also existed in the 19th century, is a major art movement during the Renaissance period. It gave sculptors the opportunity to free themselves from the past models. New works were created based on the imagination and appeal to the emotion. Ayan, kaya kung makikita ninyo, katulad nitong example nito no, ng sculpture na nakikita niyo sa slide, diba? Very, very expressive yung mga mukha nung nandun sa sculpture, yung mga muscles nila, no? Detailed din yung pagkaukit. Punta na tayo sa modern period after the Renaissance. Here are some notable artists during in the modern times. At ito yung ilan sa mga examples ng kanilang sculpture. Ito, napaka-famous nito, no? The Thinker ni Auguste Rodin. Ayan. Very humanistic pa din. Diba? Madalas human yung subject. Mas may laro na when it comes to different techniques. Yung mga artists, mas may freedom na sila. Siyempre, mas developed na yung society, mas may technology na sila na pwedeng i-inculcate or introduce sa kanilang sculpture. Ayan. And now, let's look at some recent trends in sculpture. In the 1960s, sculptors have continued to work in a variety of media and styles. Sabi ko nga, habang nag-i-improve, nagde-develop yung society, nagde-develop yung technology, kasabay nun yung development sa arts and sciences. So, in the 1960s, here are some recent trends and examples and artists that existed in the 1960s that flourished during the 1960s. Si Anthony Caro, ayan. So, yung mga kinetic sculpture, kung naalala ninyo yung discussion natin ng kinetic sculpture, ayan. Gumagamit na rin ng mga, gawa to sa fluorescent lamps, installation arts, ayan. In the 1980s naman, sculptors began moving away from the austerity of minimalism and conceptualism. Again, mas nagkakaroon ng artistic freedom yung mga tao. Organic and eccentric forms began to reappear, a tendency known as postmodern or post-minimalism sculpture. Ayan sa mga example kay Joel Shapiro, parang mga blocks lang ng kahoy na pinagdugtong-dugtong na parang makikita mo na may human form. Ito kay Nancy Graves, diba? Very colorful naman yung mga medium or materials na kanyang ginamit. Okay. So that's the end of the discussion or our lecture on the development of sculpture outside the Philippines. Now, syempre tignan din natin let's have a quick review of what happened naman sa sculpture in the Philippines. This is just a review of your Confil Arts nung senior high school kayo. Before Spanish colonization, sculptures found in the Philippines consisted of small figurines of clay, porcelain, and wood which were brought by Indians, Chinese, Javanese, and Japanese traders. Yung ilan dito matatagpuan ninyo sa National Museum. Before the end of the 16th century, the Augustinian friars established the Academy of Arts and Sciences, which helped to discover and train potential artists. Yung klase ng art na meron tayo ngayon, very influenced siya, no, by the Westerners, particularly the Spaniards. Yung painting, diba? For example, yung architecture na meron tayo ngayon, mixture din siya ng influences, no, from our colonizers. So, maraming aspeto ng art, particularly in sculpture, ay bunga ng naging experience natin from mahabang panahon ng colonization. During the first half of the 19th century, sculpture, like other arts, acquired a notable development. At lalo ngayon, nasa kasalukuyang panahon, ang daming mga mahuhusay, mga notable na mga sculptors in the Philippines. Yan. And thank you. That ends my lecture on art history, development of sculpture outside the Philippines.